Hello there. So, after a year's gap, we finally now have a new version of Maya, Autodesk Maya 2022. I've been using this new version recently, so what I'm going to do now is take you through some of the new features that I really do think you need to be aware of. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to start with is kind of a small thing really, but it's the startup time and how Maya generally boots. And if you've been using Maya as long as I have, there are some annoying things that Maya used to do. Now, for example, Maya will now start with this splash screen, and you now get a progress bar of what's actually loading whilst the application boots up. And what would happen previously would be that Maya would boot into the user interface, and it would just hang for quite some time whilst it loaded all the plugins and got the scene actually ready, which is really frustrating. So at least now it's a small annoying thing, I guess, but at least now we can see what's actually happening, and we're not being so frustrated about being to get into the package. And you can see straight away I'm in there, and that's how quick it booted. So I did a quick test with the previous version of my 2020, and that took at least 90 seconds on my machine, which is not the most powerful machine, but it's more than adequate. That took 90 seconds to load completely fully all the plugins, and you can see there how quick that actually was in stark difference. So it's a small thing, but personally, I'm glad that they've actually improved the startup time. There's also another thing as well, which isn't so obvious, but the output window is now gone. And actually, what they've done is it remembers the previous state of Maya. Now, when I first booted Maya 2022, there's another thing as well about the preferences. Now, if you're familiar with Maya, you'll know that when you take a new version and there's no preferences, it will ask you to create some default preferences, or do you want to copy over the ones from another version that you had previously installed? Well, you can still do that, but now it asks you whether or not you want to copy certain preferences, and it goes through certain categories about whether or not you want to copy over maybe the workspaces or hotkey shelves. So this is actually, not a bad idea. It's pretty good rather than copying over everything, or you do what I do and go to the preferences and then start setting everything how you previously had it. At least now you can be a bit more selective over what you want to copy over. Now, regarding the output window, it no longer boots with Maya if you close it down previously. So when I first booted up my 2022, I got everything set, and the output window would appear in the bottom in my taskbar, and it would really be quite frustrating because people don't always use it. So now you can close it, and then when you reboot Maya, it doesn't come back, which is again a small annoying thing, but it did used to be quite irritating. However, you can bring it back if you like the old behavior and you do want to have it back. Then there's an environment variable that you can set, and it will force it to show up on every time you start Maya. However, if you still miss the output window and you like having it there, then it's actually available now in the Windows menu. You can just boot it up here, and there it is. And then if you want to have it there and you use this, then of course, then it's there for you to actually access. But of course, if you then close this and you reboot Maya, it won't boot up again. Okay, so let's now look at some of the very simple basics before we go into some more juicier features. Now, the big thing now is that in 2022, Python 3 is now the default scripting language, which is really good. We've now been updated, and on Windows and Linux, Maya now starts in Python 3 by default. And that's available on all platforms. And I think on Mac OS, it can only be started in Python 3 mode. Now, if you've got some legacy tools and unfortunately you may not be able to make that transition, you can still boot Maya in Python 2 mode. And what you'll need to do is add an environment variable. And what you need to do is set this one here. You set the My Python version here in your my.env, and if you do that, then it will reboot back to Python 2. This is just one of the many enhancements they've added to some of the open source plugins as well. And these are all fully documented here in the documentation. You'll see that here's a list of all the open source components that are in Maya 2022, also their version numbers which they've been updated to or changed to, and also some of the new ones that have been added to the list. And of course, they've even put all down the source of where they've actually got them from as well. So this is really good to see from Autodesk that they're supporting open source and they're giving people as much information as possible about the open source components they're now using in Maya. Some other nice little things they've now added. For example, Windows, there's now a Bifrost browser. So of course we can now see any Bifrost sample scenes and bring them into the scene we're working on. Some of these have actually got example scenes with them, and you've got an option. If I select this one here, I can open select it in a full example scene, or I could just import it into the scene I've actually got open, which is, again, it's nice to have that option. Some do, some don't have, but there's lots of examples here for you to explore. So it's good to see that they're in one simple browser now. And I think if you open these up, they'll also populate the Bifast graph as well. There's a nice little extra added to the heads-up display now. There's now an actual game vertex count option, and of course you can even set the evaluator to be based on whether or not you use Unreal or Unity, which is really handy. And again, that will then display in the head-up display. It should activate it first. There we go, and it's just up there. And of course you can still turn on your polygon stuff as well, and it populates there. So this is really good now, because many people are now starting to use real-time engine technology in their workflow. So having that extra little option there is quite handy. Another nice addition is support for the Rokoko Motion Library. That's available here under the animation editors. And again, if you've got an account with those guys, then of course you can enter your details here and import your data straight into the Maya scene. This is actually a plugin as well. So if you don't want it, then you can quickly go to the plugin manager and then just deactivate it down the bottom here. There we go. Another new addition that's open source is now support for OpenColorIO version 2. And again, this is now going to be the default the default color management for Maya. And straight away it'll go into the ASIS color management system here. You can, of course, go into your preferences and change this here and do all the kind of changes that you wish to. If you don't have, if you're using a renderer which isn't supporting OpenColorIO at this moment in time, then you can use an environment variable called Maya Color Management Sync Color to basically boot Maya into the previous version of the color management system, so that your scenes will still work. And then of course you can turn it off if eventually they get updated to OpenColorIO. Now, what's worth noting though, that if you load in a scene which has come from another version of Maya and didn't have OpenColorIO, just check your color management here in the viewport and you'll notice that it's got a legacy at the end of it. And if you open this box, you'll see that all the options have a legacy option. And that's telling you that basically OpenColorIO is not supported, and you'll probably have to activate that environment variable to make sure your scenes might load correctly. You can have it as an environment variable, or you can load it as a per session thing. So you've got the option for both. And finally, on just some of the small little housekeeping things, the minimum system requirements for Linux have changed now. There's new Visual Studio and GCC versions are now supported. So on Windows, Visual Studio has been updated to 2019.7, and there's no changes to the system requirements. And on Linux, GCC has been updated to 9.3.1. And Linux users will require CentOS OS 7.6 or higher to use Maya now. So, you know, these are small things that may not be important to some people, but it's always worth checking these things out in the documentation just to make sure you got yourself covered if you want to start installing Maya into your pipeline or your studio. Okay, so let's now start looking at some of the more bigger and more important features. The first thing I'm going to look at is now Pixar's USD. Now, if you're familiar with Maya, you'll know that last year Autodesk released their own Maya to USD plugin, and it was also made open source on GitHub for anybody who wanted to download that source code and start implementing it into their pipelines. Now Maya 2022 ships with a new version of that plugin, which can easily be loaded. And there's some really good additions now to the plugin and what they've done with the actual workflow in order to better facilitate you being able to work with USD data inside Maya. Now, of course, the basic, most simplest method was to simply just go to your import module, and you can now just do a simple USD import. And if we just select any kind of object, I'm going to use the Pixar kitchen set as my example. Now, in the dialog box here on the options, there was some decent stuff here that was always worth checking out. The hierarchy view is there again, and you can choose your variants and even choose particular prims if you want to, or just choose to load the whole thing, which is what I'm going to do. You'll also notice there's now material support as well, and it can even do a conversion as well. So if you're bringing in data from another software package, which has maybe got some basic materials that have come from that software, you may want to convert it to any one of these options. And of course, if you're going to take the plugin itself and implement it, then you're going to have the capability to add your own render support in here as well. I'm going to leave it as is and just import it. Now, this would basically do a conversion, essentially. So this would bring in a USD model file and then essentially turn it into Maya data so that you could use it natively in Maya and work with this data in the usual Maya way. So that's just loaded in here. And it took a little bit of time, and I've just realized now that actually this uses Z up. So I've got to quickly just change that, which is slightly annoying. And of course, when you do this, the camera goes a bit wonky, but there's always if there's a quick way of doing this, just go to your predefined bookmarks and reset the perspective, and that will get you back on track. Now, with the outliner now, you'll see that this comes in as a kitchen set, and it just looks like my data. And if you select it, it appears as my data in the UI, which is all perfectly fine. And now you can work on it as normal. But this is really essentially Maya structured data. It's not, it's come from a USD file, and all you can really do here is make some changes and then select them and then re-export them back out as a USD file. And if you choose that USD file, I'll just go back to my main samples now and just choose one of these. There's options here you can choose, but the main thing as well, you can even retain some of the material and shader information as this export. So there's a render man for Maya support, and there's Arnold shaders, of course, because Arnold now is the default renderer inside Maya. There's also the M2H, the Hydra render in there as well, and I'll quickly highlight that later. And that just gives you the round trip of essentially importing a USD model and then exporting to a USD model. What you can now do, and this is expanded from before, there's now this universal scene description option from the create menu. Now, before you could bring in a stage from a new layer, but now you can bring in a stage from a file. And what this basically does, I'm going to go back to my kitchen set again and look how quick this is. If I select the USD file now, it will choose, I can specify a specific prim path if I want to, or even exclude it if I want to as well, if I've got data spread in different parts of my pipeline. And I can even choose to load or not load payloads at this time. And I'm going to assume for the moment that you're familiar with USD and some of the terminologies. If you're not quite familiar with that, then I would really recommend that you basically start looking at it. And I'll include some links in the description of places you can go to, where there's some really good videos from people who actually explain this stuff. So I'm going to choose kitchen set, and if I do create right now, look how quick that loaded in. It was massively quicker than before, and the simple reason for that is that it's not converting it to Maya data structured now. If you look at the node in the outliner, there's nothing there. There's just the flat parent node. And in the attribute editor, you'll notice that now this is now my USD proxy shape. So straight away, the outliner looks different, and also the attribute editor looks different. Now, to expand out the hierarchy, we just need to go to our display option in outline and choose shapes. And we can now expand this out. And you'll notice we're now expanding it out in the USD structure. But what's different is you'll notice some of the icons are different and the color scheme is different. And what this is telling us now, that this is now essentially native USD data. You'll notice that the icons are a little bit different in places, and that's because that's retaining the structure of the USD file that we had. And if I expand some of these out a bit more, if I just go to this one here, which is the fridge, you'll notice that there's some things that are stuck to it now, some decoration. And if you look at the icon here, they've changed the icon badges in the outliner now. So now I've got a more of a visual cue as to what type of prim I'm looking at. And if I hover over, you'll see the little pop-up box. This is appearing now in my UI, and I can see that introduced composition arcs are, there's a reference, payload, and a variant. Now, if I right-click this now, I've now got a new contextual menu for my outliner data, which is specific to now USD. This is a variant set, so I can choose the modeling variant and quickly swap this out. And this was something you just couldn't do if you brought this data in via the import method. And of course, at any one time, I can quickly just go back and even set it back. So that's really good to have that option now. If you want to change this color coding, then of course you can quickly just go to the color settings, and in the outliner option, there's an option here called non-native data branches. is set to this blue color. You can change that if you want to. Now, of course, if we go back to our outliner again, if I bring up the contextual menu again, there's a few other options. I can choose to unload the entire variant like so, or I can just quickly bring it back in. I can even choose to deactivate it, and I can even start adding a prim now. And you'll notice these extra nodes here. I can include a def, which really can be whatever I want to really. I can even include a scope, doesn't need any transforms, for example, like material information, shaded groups, etc., etc. And I can even add a reference as well. So there's some really good options here if you want to work on this native data. And of course, once you're finished with it, you can just go back up here and export it as a USD file again, which is absolutely perfect. Now, of course, the other option I've got now is I can actually now start creating my own USD native hierarchy inside Maya. Again, go to my create menu and choose stage of empty layer. This gives me my top node, and now I can start right clicking this, add a new prim, and then I can now start bringing in add a reference, and I can pick in whatever asset I want from my file, and I've just brought it in like so. And you can see there, that's the hierarchy, there's the geometry, and that's what made it up. And of course, I can now start bringing in USD files from other Maya scenes or even other packages that have also exported it as USD, and I can now start creating a native USD structure. Now, another cool option to this as well is I can have essentially both types of data, you could call it, occupy the same scene at the same time. And again, this is where those visual cues really come in handy. I've re-imported the kitchen set again, and you can see I've got my Maya structure here. But what I can still do, I can go to my create menu and now bring in stage from file, choose the same kitchen set again, and this time it brings a lot quicker. And of course, I can just move off to one side, and I've now got both assets in the same scene, but again, I can see the difference between the structures. So if I've got different types of data in my scene and I'm bringing in USD data from other sources, and if I bring it in as a native file, I can quickly see the differences straight away in my outliner. Okay, now one of the coolest features they've added now to the Maya USD workflow is the new USD layer editor, and we can access that by right-clicking on that node and just select USD layer editor. This brings up a whole new option box now. And what this essentially allows you to do is work with layers on USD data, which are very much like opinions, you might say, in terms of if you want to make changes to the scene. And this can be done on a per project level, per department, per user. And what I can now do is I can still create stage from file here, or even a new layer, but I can also save the USD format here out as well. If any one time I can right click this and save it out. I can even add different layers here as well. And I can easily just add layers here. I can even take layers and parent them together. So some really good stuff here. Now it's named anonymous because it's in memory and I haven't saved it out yet. So I'm not really going to go to that now. But to really shortcut this now, if I was to just delete these for a moment, I can also load in layers that I've already done. So I can just load in something here like called sequence, load it in, and I've now got different layers here. And you'll notice that that chair seemed to pop into place. That's because this layer here for layout has changes to it. So if I mute it, I can quickly see what's going on. Same with the fridge as well. I can do sequence dressing, turn that on and off. And at any one time, if I say, well, actually, I actually like the chair here, I don't like what's been done, I can select this now, move the chair, save the edits out, and then I've saved it to a USD file. And again, I haven't actually touched the structure of the entire file. All the changes I've made are recorded at this level, and I can even print them to the script editor as well. So again, it gives me a whole idea of what's actually, it gives me a list of all the things that I've done in a text format, so I could debug them as well. So there's a lot to go through here. I'm not going to go through the whole workflow now, but I've done another video that explores this in a little bit more depth, where I kind of go through the simple workflow and how to make it work. So please do check that out. Also included in this USD update is better support for USD data in the viewport. And that just gives us way more flexible options than what we had before. So now if I go to my renderer here in viewport, I've got viewport 2.0, which is fine. I can now select GL for Hydra, and I can also select Arnold Hydra as well. So if I select Arnold Hydra, for example, this will kick in the Arnold renderer, and you can see now I've got some decent rendering support inside my viewport, and I can quickly rotate my scene and Arnold will kick into life and start to produce a render for us. So again, there's a lot more flexible options now for people who really want to get into USD data in order to display it properly in their viewport. So yeah, there's been some really good additions now to the Maya USD workflow. At the time of when I've done this video, I don't know if they've released the source code yet, but I would suspect that they probably will at some point. And again, it's good to see Autodesk contributing to the open source community over USD, which is now what many people are now starting to look at implementing into their pipelines. There's been some nice updates to the animation features inside Maya now. So one of the big things they've added in is this new animation ghosting, and that's available here in Visualize. You've got a new ghosting editor. So if you bring this up, what this essentially enables you to do is create almost like an echo of the character going forward and backwards, so you can see what its shape is gonna be, or where it's gonna be in several frames ahead, or where it's been several frames behind. And it's not the same as a motion trail. Motion trails really work on curves. So you select your controller and you will create a trail which works a bit like an F curve, and you can move it and manipulate it. What this will do is this actually creates echoes. So if I was to select this guy's jacket now, and I move his arm, and I want his arm to move in a certain direction, or I may want to see what is happening. Bring the ghost editor now. I can choose different objects types. I can choose all of these if I want to, but I'm only going to focus on the object. And I've got some basic presets here of kind of how I want the ghost to work. So this will be ghosts on frames that precede and follow the current frame, obviously, and then just the ones before, just the ones after, and it's fairly self-explanatory here. I'm just going to create ghosts from selection. And you see that straight away. You get this in the viewport, and this now I can see the kind of transition almost on a per frame basis of what's happening. And of course, it will move, it will adjust accordingly and maintain, because I've always got 5 pre-frames and 6 post frames. I can change that, of course. I can take this up to really quite a lot, or even set just down to say 2 or 3. And again, having that flexibility is really handy. So I can really start to see what's happening to my shape going forwards without having to scrub so much in the timeline. I've now got a lot more of a visual cue. I can even change the opacity of this if I want to, even change the colors. And I can keep adding them here. I can just turn them on and off if I want to. It's entirely up to me, but it's not a bad feature if you're an animator and you want to see how things are going to work ahead and before time, really. So I think it's a really good addition to the overall feature set. Another really nice little addition is the updates to the bookmarks, and I believe this has perhaps come from feedback from several users about how they can improve this, which is really good to see Autodesk listening properly to their users. Now, if you had a bookmark, you could add it down here, and this would enable you to add a bookmark in the timeline. But they've now added a new bookmark manager, so I can actually now start to set playback range and even start to add a name to my bookmark and actually set them here, but without having to do it in the timeline, which is, I think, a really good addition. And of course, the more bookmarks you add, then of course you can start to basically see how many you have in your scene and retrieve them at any time you want. I'm just going to put, say, go 1 to 52 now, and you'll see that's now in my timeline. Now, the other thing as well is if you wanted to move this, so if I expand it out now to my full range, and of course my caching is going to catch up, I want to move this. If I want, now I can hold down my control key now, and I can quickly just double click it and it will select it, which is a lot better. I can also quickly move this as well in a lot more of an interactive way than before. So again, holding the control key, just highlight over it, and I can now just move this to and change it to wherever I want in the timeline. And again, this is really handy because you may not want to have loads of individual bookmarks. You just want to you may want to work in particular segments as well. And again, this will snap, and you can have this turn on and off as well in the timeline. Of course, that will update in the editor as well. So again, you can see that my thing has now changed. And if I added them here, I could set it here if I want to. I can even, if I had multiple ones, I could quickly just flick through the next bookmark. So I can quickly snap to each bookmark I want. If I've got a long timeline, for example, and I've got multiple bookmarks in play, I can quickly see them here and then just snap to the ones I actually want. There's been a couple of nice enhancements to Maya's graph editor now in this new version. If we just bring this up here for this controller I've got selected, you'll notice that I've got a peak here which I don't really like or want. It might have come in there by accident, or maybe I've got some mocap data and it's not been cleaned up correctly, and I need to get rid of that. Now if it's an individual curve like this, I can easily just quickly remove it. But there's a new tool that we can use to kind of remove this really easily, and that's really handy if you've got multiple F curves. So for example, I go to curves now, we now have this peak removal filter. Now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to just select this. I'm going to use the entire range now and just click preview, and you'll notice that I got rid of it, but also it pretty much wiped out some of my other curves as well, and I want to retain them. So really what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to select these ones here. Let's probably do this one here as well. Go to selection, and that's cleaned up a lot better. It's maybe just made a slight change here, but again, I can quickly change that if I want to, or even just reduce the selection criteria. So that's easily done. But anyway, it's good to have that there, particularly if you're starting out, and if you've got some data before you start even animating. If you've got some peaks in there, you can run that filter over it and to clean those things up. There's also a smooth filter as well, just to double check things again, and that you can see that I've just added it straight away, and it's actually added it on there. And again, if I just turn off the preview, you can see what that's actually done as well, as it's tried to smooth it off across the actual selection. If I change it to all and do another preview, so you can see it kind of does its best to smooth it out, and perhaps does a little bit of a too good a job, but it might start to take out some of those nice nuances I might have added to this animation. So again, I think you've got to be very careful how you use this. But again, if you've got some data before you start animating, and you want to basically clean it up before you really start getting into lots of work, then I think these two filters are going to be really handy for you. In terms of rigging, there's been some really useful updates now to this latest Maya release. The one I like the most is the introduction of the new component tags. What these basically do is essentially replace the workflow of sets and group IDs, which is being deprecated. What this allows you to do now is to create sets of components, but on the shape itself. If I select my jacket here for my character, in the attribute editor under the shape, you can see now I've got these three components that I've created. And these are all parts of the geometry that I want to maybe use as part of my workflow. Maybe they want to deform differently, or I want to add different effects to these. And I can break it down in terms of faces or edges or even verts. But what I've done here, it's very, very simple to use. Now, if I wanted to, okay, this maybe first create a new set. I'll just let this right zip, for example, and I'll just add that in, and I'll just call it, jackets right zip. And okay, that's fine. But I've noticed that in my selection, I haven't really selected everything. I've missed it off. So what I can do, again, I can just quickly select these as well, and then right click and simply add those components as well. So I've got complete control to add all the things I need, or even remove anything if I want as well. And that's really handy. And you can see there's a nice visual cue here as well to see what type of component it actually is when it's faces or verts. And also it tells me his account here as well, which again is really useful. What this also does, it cleans up the node editor a little bit, so it saves you having to create multiple nodes, which was often a workflow you'd have to work with, particularly in characters when you had parts of the skin or geometry that you wanted to deform in a certain way. But you still have the option to do that now. It's just a little bit more flexible for you. Now, one thing to bear in mind with these as well, again, a previous workflow, people would often use tweak nodes on their geometry. Now, for these new component tags, tweak nodes are not automatically created. You can still add a deformer here, but you can still create them if you want to use them as part of this workflow. And again, you might have some old characters you may want to update or maybe introduce into Maya 2022. You can go to the preferences, and under animation, under rigging, you've got the option here to add tweak nodes on Deformer creation. So you've got the option there if you want it. You can also, again, automatically create component tags on Deformer creation as well. And also you've got the option to use component tags for deformation component sets as well. So you've got options there to adapt it to really how you work. But I think this is a really useful introduction now, and particularly when you also think about the extra deformers they've added as well. They've added like a solidified deformer and even a morph deformer now. So the solidified deformer is going to be really useful. What that actually does is it creates areas of geometry that appear more solid on deformed geometry and lets you define more rigid parts of it, say. And a good example of that is characters' clothes, like the zip and the buckles. So having the components there on the shape and then introducing that deformer into the workflow, it gives it a lot more flexibility. It creates a little bit more of a streamlined workflow than what you would have done it previously. So I think that's really, really useful. And also, just another little thing as well, under the skin options now, they've got the extra option to add now the proximity wrap for the deformer node. And I think this is a really useful option now, because being able to use that deformer to bind skin instead of the usual skin cluster, that gives you just that little bit extra control over the binding in the attribute editor, especially if you want to use another geometry to basically influence that as well. So I think I think that could be really useful for some people. Now, there hasn't been too much added in terms of modeling features for this release, so I think it's mainly been around bug fixes, which are still very much welcome. In terms of modeling and bug fixes, it's definitely worth checking them out, because there's a really good one now, which, well, how many times have you done this? This is in Maya 2020. It's not the best mesh in the world, but I'm just going to do a very crude example, and you just want to do a simple extrude. And I'm not even going to change anything to do one, like so. And straight away you've got, it looks great all around here, and then you get this weird face pops out and you've got to go in there and you've got to manually correct it, right? Okay, that's happened more times than I'm sure you could possibly remember. Let's now go into my 2022, same mesh object, everything's exactly the same. This time I'm going to select it here, do one, and it works. And now we've got an extrude that kind of doesn't have weird popping faces. So yeah, I'm sure that fix alone is probably going to be really useful to many of you. However, one of the new things I have added is this new sweep mesh feature, which basically gives me the ability to create a mesh from a simple curve shape. It's available here in the create menu. I'm just going to choose sweep mesh. It adds a mesh and also a curve in my scene, and I can then start making some modifications with this new sweep mesh creator. I can use a poly. I just change some of the size, make it a little bit more rounder. I can cap it, and again I can start to change various shapes that I want as well. But what's really handy is the flexibility of it. I can start to maybe change the profile a little bit more. I can even start to do like a twist, which doesn't really come into play until you start doing this. So if you do distribute, for example, I can now start to see I can break apart the mesh itself. And this is really handy if you want to create maybe rope or some kind of cord. So now if I do the twist now, I could start to increase this and then start to maybe look at the precision of it as well. And again, you can see this is a lot easier than what it would be before. And of course, there's a curve here as well. So what I can do now is I'm just going to just do something quick and easy. And again, start to manipulate this in the way I usually would. So straight away, it's a lot more flexible, a little more intuitive, way more interactive. And again, anytime I can go back to my sweep mesh creator and I can start changing maybe a taper at one end, for example. I can rotate the profile. I can even start to scale it all the way back up as well. And it retains the relative scales of the objects as well. And again, I can increase the number of instances, but then start to overlap. So yeah, it's a nice little feature, and if you're going to use it for anything, then I think this would be the way to do it. I'm trying to think actually how I would do this without this feature, and I think it would be pretty hard. So actually this is quite a useful addition. In terms of rendering, there's been some updates to Arnold just to make sure that it's kept up to date and supports the new features that have been added into Maya 2022. We now have support for OpenColorIO version 2.0. There's also support for USD as well. We can choose to export our Arnold objects or scene to USD here, or we could choose there's support for either the USD objects to be rendered in the viewport or even via Arnold. So we've got that. It's good to have that support as well. In terms of the features themselves, there's some extra options being added here to the images. We've now got a light mixer, so we can add multiple lights and blend their tints together. We've also got enhancement to the lens effect, where we can add a bloom effect both in the post or pre-render, and also the denoiser options have been added as well. So again, there's some really nice options there if you're looking to use Arnold as part of your rendering pipeline. And when it comes to Bifrost, well, it is mainly a bug fix release really. So the version we're on now is 2.2.11, and there's no changes here that will break backward compatibility to the previous version. So you can be safe to know that nothing's going to break there. But there's lots of good enhancements and fixes that have been done here, and that's all documented in the Bifrost website. And Bifrost has had a lot of updates over the recent months anyway, so Autodesk will continue to do this at their own pace. And this is the good thing about having it as a plugin now, because they can then issue updates separately. And of course, you can download the Bifrost plugin completely independently of Maya anyway, so you can always keep up to date with it if you want to. And with that, we've reached the end of the video. Thanks very much for watching. I really do hope that you've been able to get a good overview of the new features in Autodesk Maya 2022. I really do think it's a good release, and I've heard it described as there's something in there for everybody, and I'd say that's a very accurate statement. I think there's some really good features around USD. It's very excited to see where that's going to go. And I think there's also some features that have been introduced which perhaps maybe give an indication of what Autodesk are maybe planning for the future. So I'd really recommend that you keep an eye on their social media channels, because they're starting to put a lot more information out there to their users. So, you know, if you want to keep up to date, then it's a good idea to keep monitoring their channels. If you're looking to know a little bit more about Autodesk products and solutions, then a reseller I'd thoroughly recommend you contact is Blue GFX here in the UK. I work with them quite a lot, and they're the UK's largest 3ds Max and Maya reseller, and also they're one of the primary Autodesk Gold partners for media entertainment in the EMEA region, and they really know their stuff. And I'll include their details below in the description, so if you want to know a little bit more, then by all means reach out to them. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.